Hi, and welcome to Common Rules Part 1. So there are many different common rules in English, but we're going to talk about the most common ones that I see in college level academic English. I've chosen these because they're very common, but also because they're some of the easiest to understand. They're very clear, they're not complex. You're going to come across some professors in your academic career who are very strict about comma usage and others who aren't, but you want to write as if every professor is very strict about it. So that's not to say, though, that I want you to feel anxious or worried about your comma usage. Watch this video, look up other resources, and make sure that you're talking to professors about comma rules to learn more and make yourself feel more comfortable. So why do professors care so much about commas anyway? So for one, comma errors are very distracting and prevent us from focusing on the content of your essay. As a student, you never want the person who's grading you to be distracted by those comma errors or any other surface level errors for that matter. But why is that? Well, we're more likely to be critical of your essay if it takes us longer to grade it, or if we have to work to understand your content and your arguments. Professors also encourage correct comma usage because it improves your credibility as a student and a writer. Credibility is showing that you have experience, education, and knowledge. In this case, you want to show your professors that you know what you're doing when it comes to writing, even if you feel like you don't. Think of it as fake it till you make it. Correct comma usage helps you fake it till you make it with your writing. But whether you're a strong writer, a weak writer, or somewhere in between, correct comma usage increases your credibility and makes your writing easier to understand and easier to grade. So what are some of the comma rules that are important to know for college level writing? Here's some of our common comma rules. First is separating two independent clauses. Second, we have separating a dependent clause from the independent clause that it precedes. Number 3, we have avoiding comma splices. Number 4, we have avoiding fused sentences. That's also known as run-ons. Number 5 through number 8 we're going to talk about in the next video, but just to go over them. Number 5 is going to be serial commas. Number 6, introductory phrases. Number 7, dates. And number 8, letters, as in writing a letter, like a cover letter or writing a letter to someone. Okay? So those are our 8 comma rules. There's a lot more, but we're going to just focus on these in the 2 videos. And as I said, just these first 4 in this video. Okay? These last 4 will be for the next video. So let's start by talking a little bit about independent and dependent clauses. You have to know what independent and dependent clauses are before you can understand comma rules 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let's analyze these words to help us understand what they mean. I call this word analysis. Word analysis. So if something is independent, that means that it doesn't rely on someone or something else to do something or to be complete. I always think about the 2000 song called Independent Woman by Destiny's Child. In this song, Kelly Rowland, Beyonce, and Michelle Williams sing about how they do things for themselves without anyone else helping them. So the lyrics say, the shoes on my feet, I bought it. The clothes I'm wearing, I bought it. The rock I'm rocking, I bought it because I depend on me if I want it. Okay, so all about independence. An independent clause is the same. It doesn't need anything else to make it a complete sentence or to help it do its job. It may have additional words, it may have additional phrases as well, but it doesn't have to. A dependent clause, on the other hand, it's going to need something else, and it's going to depend on something else to make it complete, to make it a complete sentence. Makes sense so far? So let's talk about this word clause then. Independent and dependent clauses are not the only type of clauses. The word clause means a group of words. Since there are so many different groups of words, it's important that we use a descriptive word before clause so we can know what's the purpose of clause besides just grouping words together. That doesn't tell us much that it's a group of words. So some of the different clauses include independent, like we talked about, dependent clauses, relative clauses. These are also known as adjective clauses, adverb clauses, noun clauses, and so on. So an independent clause is a group of words that doesn't need anything else to make it a complete sentence, just to reiterate. It can stand on its own. That's another way we say it. In contrast, the dependent clause does need something else to make it a complete sentence. It cannot stand on its own. So what does a dependent clause need to make it a complete sentence, though? It actually needs an independent clause, so you put those two together. There are many ways to put a dependent clause and an independent clause together to form a complete sentence. You might have the dependent clause come first. You might have the independent clause come first. Or the dependent clause can sometimes go in the middle of an independent clause and actually split it. So, an independent clause, just to reiterate, does not require anything else to be a complete thought, but a dependent clause does. So how do we tell the difference between an independent and a dependent clause? These two clauses are actually remarkably similar. They both need a subject and they both need a verb. They can have a predicate, but they don't have to. With all this being said, a dependent clause has something that the independent clause doesn't actually have. It has an additional word or phrase that makes the dependent clause sound incomplete. The dependent clause either has what we call a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. Both of these grammatical elements make a dependent clause sound incomplete. So let's look at an example to see how a subordinating conjunction can make a dependent clause sound incomplete, or basically it sounds like it needs something else to be a finished sentence. Here is an independent clause that we're going to make dependent. Our independent clause is growth mindset is an effective way of thinking. Let's add the subordinating conjunction while to this independent clause to make it dependent. While growth mindset is an effective way of thinking. Do you notice how the dependent clause sounds incomplete? It sounds like it needs something else to make it complete. But how do we make a dependent clause sound complete? We have to add an independent clause to it. While growth mindset is an effective way of thinking, it requires dedicated effort to learn to have a growth mindset. That's our complete sentence. It requires dedicated effort to have a growth mindset is an independent clause. It has a subject, a verb, and it doesn't have a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. Now that we've spent some time talking about the difference between these two types of clauses, let's discuss why you need to know what these two clauses are. You have to know what these two clauses are because there are 4 comma rules that are associated with the use of independent and dependent clauses. One of the most common comma errors that I see in the college level writing is not using a comma and fanboys to separate 2 independent clauses. So the fanboys are the words for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. As a note, fanboys can be used in other ways besides separating 2 independent clauses. If the fanboys are not separating 2 independent clauses, they are not acting as fanboys, so this comma rule doesn't apply in these cases. Okay, getting back to when fanboys do need a comma and common errors. There are many things that students do instead of using a comma and fanboys to separate 2 independent clauses. So for one, many students do not include a fanboys. If you don't include a fanboys, then you're going to end up with what is called a comma splice. Basically, the comma is splicing or splitting 2 independent clauses incorrectly. This is the comma rule number 3 that I mentioned earlier. The other common error is just to run 2 independent clauses together without anything separating them. This is known as a run-on or a fused sentence. It's fused together. This is comma rule number 4. All of this is to say that you need to use a fanboys and a comma together to correctly separate those 2 independent clauses. Now keep in mind this is not the only way to separate independent clauses though. 2 independent clauses may also be separated by a period or a full stop. In addition, they can be separated by a semicolon if the 2 independent clauses are closely related. Lastly, you can do 2 independent clauses separated by a semicolon, conjunctive adverb, and comma altogether. So if you find that you have a fused sentence or a comma splice, you can choose any of those 4 methods to separate those two independent clauses in your sentence. The next comma rule we're going to talk about is separating a dependent clause from the independent clause that it precedes, as in it comes before. So that's to say, when a dependent clause comes before an independent clause, you need to include a comma to separate those two. The comma should go in the middle of these two clauses. However, when you have an independent clause that comes before the dependent clause in a sentence, you do not need to separate these with a comma, okay? This error comes up a lot, especially when the dependent clause starts with the subordinating conjunction because. So if you're like me, you were taught that the word because is always preceded by a comma. This is actually not a rule in American English. The rule is actually that when a dependent clause comes before an independent clause in a sentence, you need to use a comma to separate those two. But you do not need to use a comma to separate these two clauses if the independent clause comes first. So let me show you an example. Because fixed mindset is so commonplace in our society, teachers should work diligently to educate their students and their students' parents about the negative effects of fixed mindsets. In that sentence, the dependent clause comes first, so that is why there is a comma at the end of the dependent clause. Let's reverse the order of the clauses in this sentence and see how a comma is not used to separate these two clauses when they are in the opposite order. Teachers should work diligently to educate their students and their students' parents about the negative effects of fixed mindset because fixed mindset is so commonplace in our society. I know this looks strange, but this is the correct way to separate an independent clause that comes before a dependent clause. You'll notice that there's no comma. So this video covered the first 4 comma rules. There are still 4 more comma rules, but I'm going to separate these rules into another video. Is there anything that I missed about the first 4 comma rules or have questions? Add these in the comments below or contact me. Until next time.